So I'm pleased to welcome here J. Diehl, who is professor at the Long Island University in New York, at the Long Island University in New York. He's professor there since 2011. He had his PhD in NYU. He had several research appointments, research grants in Ghent or in Notre Dame. And as you know, is working especially on cultural and intellectual studies, history, on manuscript studies. His works are very known for people who are working on high Middle Ages cultural studies. He had, as you know, published very recently a splendid and fascinating article about our origin and his manuscript transmission related to the reform of Saint-Laurent de Liège. So very nice work. And I think he will give us here a splendid talk about his last researches around Saint-Laurent and the priest and the teaching around priesthood.
Yeah.
So just giving you the floor.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for having me. This is really a rare treat for me to be able to speak across the ocean like this. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here. And then we shall make it full screen. Good. This is visible to everyone. This is good.
Nice. Perfect.
Excellent. Good. So I'd like to sort of start a little bit by offering a bit of background about the bigger project from which I've taken the material for this presentation. For a number of years, a lot of years, as Paul has just indicated, I've been working on a project that tries to rethink the history of monastic learning at the turn of the 12th century by studying the manuscripts of the monastery of Saint-Laurent, which probably many of you are familiar with. Saint-Laurent was an 11th century foundation in the city of Liège itself, the seat of power for the Prince Bishop of the Diocese of Liège. It's probably best known as the home of the monastic theologian Rupert of Deutz, who was the most prolific writer of the 12th century. But Saint-Laurent's cultural significance definitely goes far beyond the career of just this one monk. And I think one of the big witnesses to this is its extensive surviving collection of manuscripts. There's about 70 of them, give or take, from the 11th and 12th centuries, nearly all of them in outstanding condition. And as a whole, I think still very much understudied. There are studies of them, but as a full collection, still kind of understudied. Most of my work has focused on a core group of about 30 manuscripts, all of which I think were made during a very intense period of scribal production between about 1095 and 1110. And the challenge I've really been confronting with this project from the start is finding a way to shape all this manuscript evidence into a narrative, a kind of coherent story about the transformation of monastic learning. Fortunately, however, the monks of Saint-Laurent were very obliging. They've left us some clues that kind of help unravel the significance of all these manuscripts. And I'll highlight two facts here. First, the production of really a remarkable number of these early 12th century manuscripts can be contextualized within very specific events taking place in and around the abbey. And for the most part, these events were kind of ecclesiastical conflicts between the monks of Saint-Laurent and the bishop and the clergy of Liège, which also just prompted a kind of growing reliance on the written word as a way of negotiating and mediating authority. And they also kind of prompted a growing awareness of the role of different types of media in transmitting and preserving knowledge. Second, the scribes of Saint-Laurent really pursued a very carefully designed program of book production that was really sensitive to the materialities of communication. And we can see this sensitivity in the fact that basically all, pretty much all except one of the early 12th century books of Saint-Laurent, can be very easily grouped into four kind of families of manuscripts that are united both by the genre of text they contained and the material format of the book. So their size, their format, their decoration, and things like this. And just to give a quick example of these four families right here, at the very top of the hierarchy are these, the kind of patristic books, the luxurious patristic books, nearly all patristic biblical commentaries, and always containing only one complete text. And these are, unsurprisingly, the largest books, invariably 2 columns of texts, and generally the only Saint-Laurent books with decorative initials in multiple colors of ink. Right below this, we have a slightly smaller family of books that I call the historical family of manuscripts, very much resembling the patristic manuscripts, but always a little bit more modestly sized, often containing 2 or maybe 3 large texts. And these books all contain historical works, generally historical, generally ecclesiastical history. Then at the bottom of the spectrum, there are 2 families of miscellanies, both much smaller in size, made from visibly lower quality parchment. One of these, which I have up on the screen right here, is distinguished by always having 2 columns of texts. And you can see this repertoire of very large, bold initials, always in red ink, sometimes almost overlapping with each other. All of these manuscripts contain a variety of texts related to asceticism, to penitential practices, and to the monastic life. And then finally, there is a very small group of manuscripts, the smallest Saint-Laurent manuscripts by far, always with a single block of texts, but sometimes paired with remarkably intricate initials for such tiny little books. And these contain exclusively texts related in one way or another to clerical or to priestly life. It's these last 2 groups of miscellanies, and particularly this one related to priestly life, that are really the focus of my discussion today. And what I'm going to try to do is place their production in the context of events taking place at Saint-Laurent in the early 12th century, and draw out some of the processes that I think kind of shaped the culture of learning there. Broadly, what I'd like to argue is that the defense of monastic rights to priestly status was a really important aspect of monastic reform, and a renewed commitment to sacerdotal culture represents an underappreciated dynamic shaping monastic learning at the start of this broader revival we sometimes call the 12th century Renaissance. A little bit more specifically, I'm going to trace 2 processes through the evidence of these manuscripts. First, the ways in which the monks of Saint-Laurent found themselves in the midst of an ecclesiastical crisis, kind of simultaneously fighting for the special prerogatives of monastic communities, and yet also for their customary rights as priests in the Church of Liège. And they kind of have to confront some of the contradictions of this. And then second, we're going to look at the ways in which this fight spilled over into questions about the nature of monastic and clerical learning, and kind of created a set of uncertain educational boundaries, and prompted a growing reliance on the written word for priestly education at Saint-Laurent. The picture that I hope emerges from the manuscripts of Saint-Laurent offers a new perspective on the history of monastic education. On one hand, we're going to see here a group of monks that was much less interested in developing a distinctive mode of monastic learning than they were in finding a way to both extol the special status of monasticism, but also to remain participants in the clerical world of the cathedral schools. And on the other hand, I hope to kind of give a hint here of the kind of bigger argument of the whole project, which is that the history of the media and the materiality of knowledge transmission was an integral part of the story of monastic learning in the early 12th century. So, to get into this story, let's set the stage a little bit. The Diocese of Liège, where all of this stuff is taking place. It doesn't often get credited as such, but the Diocese of Liège is kind of a heartland of very venerable monastic communities. You've got Saint-Hubert, Saint-Trond, Stavelot, L'Aube. All of these could trace their history back to the 7th century and were major centers of monastic culture in the 11th century. You have Gembloux and Bronn added to the scene in the early 10th century. And so when Saint-Laurent was founded by the Bishop of Liège in 1026, its inhabitants were joining a region of monasticism that was as prestigious as any other in the empire. However, somewhat unlike, say, Saint-Hubert, kind of tucked away in the Ardennes, or the Stavelot, kind of tucked away in these forests in the Amble Valley, Saint-Laurent is an urban monastery. It is parked near the center of the city of Liège. It is only minutes from the Cathedral of Saint-Laurent. I think I may have used this map last time I presented for you, Paul. I'm not sure. But you can see here that Saint-Laurent is right on top of the cathedral. And in this respect, the monks of Saint-Laurent found themselves in a different situation than some of their monastic confreres throughout the diocese, because Liège, the city, was very much a city of clerics. Its ecclesiastical landscape was dominated by a kind of archipelago of collegiate churches centered on the Cathedral of Saint-Lambert itself. But the monks of Saint-Laurent were no outsiders in this clerical world. As with nearly all traditional monastic communities of this era, many, perhaps most of the monks of Saint-Laurent were ordained priests, and nearly all of them would have been in clerical orders of some sort. And by embracing their identities as clerics, the monks of Saint-Laurent positioned themselves as full participants in the clerical world that directed ecclesiastical life and intellectual life in the city of Liège. Now, participation in this world was an ideal place to be. In the 11th century, Liège was arguably the most prestigious intellectual center of the empire, the Athens of the North, according to one local commentator. The fame of its schools had grown out of a partnership between its most famous bishop, Notker of Liège, and Heriger, the scholasticus and later abbot of the monastery of Lobe in the late 10th century. And so intellectual life in Liège was founded on a collaboration between monastic communities and the cathedral school. And this pretty much remained the state of affairs throughout the 11th century. And Saint-Laurent, we know, was active in this kind of collaborative intellectual world from its earliest days. We know that the community's second abbot, Lambert, had, while he was a monk of Saint-Laurent, been a disciple of the famed Adelman of Liège, a master at the cathedral. There's a monk named Falcanus at Saint-Laurent in the 1060s who had collaborated with Franco, another master at the cathedral school, on all sorts of mathematical questions and stuff. And so this idea that urban schools came along in the 12th century and displaced a world dominated by monastic schools, you still hear this as a framing device for the history of medieval education. But in Liège, we really see nothing of this. What we see is, before the 12th century, an intellectual world with really no boundary between cloister and cathedral, and in which both were active players in the 10th and the 11th centuries. Now, still, this was an intellectual world embedded in an ecclesiastical one. And the late 11th century, of course, was a turbulent one for ecclesiastics in the empire, as the contest between pope and emperor kind of reverberated throughout all of the dioceses. Liège pretty much escaped the turmoil of the 1070s through the calculated diplomacy of Bishop Henry, who's known as the Peaceful. But in 1092, Bishop Henry died, and for his successor, the emperor chose a guy named Otbert, who's an ambitious former provost of the Church of Liège, who had been deposed by the last bishop and who had spent his exile at the court of the Emperor Henry IV. Also resident at the court at the same time was a man named Wolbodo, who was the former abbot of Saint-Laurent, who had also likewise been deposed for mismanaging the abbey's estates. And in 1092, Wolbodo comes to Otbert at the court of Henry IV with a request that he be restored to the abbacy of Saint-Laurent. Money was probably involved in this. But nonetheless, it was a proposition that was advantageous to both men. So Wolbodo again gets to be the abbot of Saint-Laurent, and Otbert gets a loyalist in an important ecclesiastical position in Liège. And so it was that when Otbert returned to Liège and was consecrated, one of his first acts was to expel the current abbot of Saint-Laurent, Berengar, and install Wolbodo back in his place. However, Berengar did not take this deposition lightly. He goes into exile in Reims eventually, but was accompanied by around half the monks of Saint-Laurent who refused obedience to Wolbodo and to Otbert. And for about 3 years, the exiles kind of labored to overturn Otbert's position before finally reaching an agreement with him that allowed them to return to Liège. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that this era of exile really scarred the community. It led to the deterioration of relations between Saint-Laurent and the bishop, and it prompted the monks to explore new strategies for resisting episcopal authority. And many of these strategies appear in the manuscripts of Saint-Laurent, which were copied in the era after exile and during the monks' ongoing struggle with the bishop. So let's consider one of these for starters right here. This is a copy of the canon law collection known as the Collection in 74 Titles. That's its modern title. This is actually in the Yale Law University here on the East Coast in New York. It's copied by a monk of Saint-Laurent between probably 1092 and 1095, while half the community is still in exile. And its most interesting feature is that it's been annotated by a member of the community who was looking for authoritative refutations of Bishop Otbert's actions and for strategies for bringing litigation against the bishop. We're not going to have time to go through all of these annotations, but there are 14 of them that he's put next to sort of canons that interest him. Probably his best find is what I've got for you up on the screen right now. This is the 39th canon of the collection, and it's a forged letter purporting to be a decretal of Gregory the Great that contains an expansive declaration of monastic liberty from episcopal control, including the right to elect their own abbot. This is a famous little text, Quam sit necessarium, if you're familiar with it. And I've given you a little translation of the annotation in the margin of the manuscript here. The following canon, Canon 40, was also a pretty good one for the annotator. You can see that right there. Good. Canon 40, this is a genuine decretal letter of Gregory the Great. In fact, one of the letters that was used to create the forgery, that is Canon 39, and it also refers to the free election of abbots and gets kind of a similar annotation here in the right-hand margin that you can see. So if we talk in very general terms, the exiled monks of Saint-Laurent were essentially trying to argue that the authority to order and to organize their community should reside with the community itself rather than with the bishop. And this became a central point of contention between monastery and bishop, helps explain some of the events that took place after the community returned from exile. These annotations were probably made when in exile, but the issues they brought up continued to be points of contention after 1095 when they returned from exile. So for instance, we know that at some point between 1095 and 1106, the community adopted the customs of the Burgundian Abbey of Cluny. We have sort of secondary evidence for this. But as scholars like Stephen van der Putten and Isabel Cochelan have argued, this is unlikely to mean that the community simply began to faithfully follow a way of life identical to that at Cluny. On the contrary, I'd suggest that in these circumstances, the circumstances in which neither episcopal nor abbatial nor communal authority was really on firm ground, the customs of Cluny probably served as something of a framework for negotiating authority over monastic observance. And it's a framework that sort of all parties could get behind because Cluny itself was so prestigious. However, the customs of Cluny were not the only framework used for this negotiation. Right around the same time, scribes at the community also produced a copy of the monastic customary of Benedict of Anian, which you see right here, beginning here on this folio, and then I'll get to these little excerpts in just a moment. This, of course, promulgated at the Synod of Aachen in 817 under the Carolingian Emperor Louis the Pious, a sort of guide to how to run a monastery. And here, the interesting thing is we can be fairly certain that the copying of this customary was linked to Saint-Laurent's conflict and negotiation with the bishop, because at the end of it, and this is what's on the sort of close-up on the right-hand side here, the scribe has kind of crammed onto the folio two short canonical excerpts. And these two short canonical excerpts come from those very two canons that were annotated in the canon law collection. They're the exact same two canons on monastic liberty that had been annotated in their canon law collection. So this customary clearly represents the ongoing conflict between monastery and bishop over how exactly to order, or who had the authority to organize monastic life. And what we see here overall, I suggest, is a moment of monastic reform involving negotiations over monastic observance, but one that's kind of built on an experiment in different ways of mediating authority. Personal authority attaching to either the bishop or the abbot, communal authority, the prestigious authority of the customs of Cluny, and the textual authority of the customary of Aachen here. And in these negotiations, the monks of Saint-Laurent resisted the putative intrusions of the bishops, essentially by making new claims about monastic liberty and backing them up with these canonical texts. However, they had other options for resisting the bishop as well. For one thing, during exile, the monks of Saint-Laurent had tapped into ecclesiastical networks connecting them to Pope Urban II and had orchestrated the excommunication of Otbert in 1095. When the monks returned to Liège, he was still excommunicated and remained so for another decade, all the way until 1106. And this kind of ensured ongoing conflict in the Church of Liège because everyone had to choose whether or not to accept communion from the bishop. And this was a problem, of course, that was even more pressing for ecclesiastics. The difficult question as to whether to accept sacraments administered by whether these sacraments administered by an excommunicate were valid opened the door for doubts about the status of ordinations and consecrations. For many in Liège, the way of virtue was just to refuse either of these at the hands of Otbert. So we know, for instance, that Lambert, a monk of Saint-Laurent, initially accepted consecration as the abbot of Florens from Otbert, but later regretted the decision and resigned the position, returning back to Saint-Laurent. Rupert of Deutz very famously took a hardline stance and refused ordination as a priest by Otbert for many years, despite pressure from his own abbot to do so. And these were hotly contested issues at Saint-Laurent. And we can see this by the fact that sometime after 1095, they took back that canon law collection that they'd annotated in exile, and they copied several short texts related to sacraments, and particularly ordinations by simoniacs and schismatics, onto the final page of that canon law collection. This is sort of the last two pages. You can see the text right here. These are the first two out of the three texts on there. The first of them is a decretal letter of Urban II, originally dated to 1093, probably copied here sometime between 1095 and 1100. The contents of it, it's approving the election of a certain guy named Papo as the next bishop of Metz, but also ordering that he first be reordained as a deacon because his original ordination had been performed by a schismatic. And this is one of a very few texts ordering such a reordination, and one of the only signs that Pope Urban II was, at one point, flirting with the idea that all sacraments of excommunicates might be invalid. In the end, actually, Urban II adopts a more moderate position, allowing certain routes by which such ordinations might be valid. And this is the position reflected in the second text in the Saint-Laurent manuscript, which is another letter of Urban II sent to People of Toul in the early 1090s, sort of mapping out ways in which these sacraments might be, these ordinations might be valid. Interestingly, though, someone at Saint-Laurent was not happy with this position because they found some space on the very final folio to cram in this terribly written third text relating to sacraments by excommunicates. This is a complicated little text. It's a conflated letter of Cyprian, who is the church father best known for stringently rejecting the sacraments performed by those outside the church, and it relates to the events of the Novatianist schism in the 2nd century. There's a funny little feature of this text, which I'll show here real quick. You can't really see it in this version. The Novatianist schism in the 2nd century had a bishop named Cornelius, considered the Orthodox party, and Novatian considered the heretical party. You can see that this scribe right here has above these names put Gregory for Cornelius and Wipertus, a reference to Wiepert of Ravenna, the anti-pope, over Novatian's name. So a pretty clear sign that this text was being read not for 2nd century history, but for its relevance to 11th century ecclesiastical politics. Right, these three texts, if they don't exactly provide a coherent answer to the question of excommunication and ordination, they were nonetheless valuable resources for the most pressing ecclesiastical problem with which the monks of Saint-Laurent were forced to cope at the turn of the 12th century: how and whether to remain integrated into the clergy of Liège as they had been for their entire history. And the debate, I would suggest, kind of set two processes in motion. First, the monks of Saint-Laurent developed kind of a heightened sense of their own sacerdotal identity, their identity as priests. Second, the rift between monks and bishop kind of developed new contours. And this is because that while in theory, the issue of ordination by schismatics was one that touched all ecclesiastics in Liège, in practice, only monks were really in a position to reject contact with Bishop Otbert and retain their position in the church. And so the debate about ordination was easily mapped onto a dispute between clerics and monks. Now, the Bishop of Liège, he's finally reconciled to the papacy in the year 1106. And for the beleaguered monks of Saint-Laurent, this must have come as a relief, marking at last the end of a decade of ecclesiastical conflict and clearing the way for a return to normalcy, including the regular ordination of monks as priests by the bishop. Even Rupert of Deutz, the stubborn hardliner, consented to ordination by Otbert sometime around 1108. But if the monks expected a warm welcome from the clergy, they really failed to understand how deeply the partisanship of the last decade had rooted itself into the Church of Liège. What the monks got instead was a kind of chorus of grumbling clerical voices. Had not these recalcitrant monks spent the last 9 years voluntarily declining clerical status? Had they not been making exorbitant novel claims to the special liberated place of monasticism? So be it in the minds of the clergy. These cloistered contemplatives can live their life of prayer and leave the active life of preaching and teaching to the clergy who are not weighed down with monastic vows. And we hear these voices, these grumbling clerical voices, primarily through the testimony of Rupert of Deutz, who tells us that shortly after he accepted ordination and began to teach, write, and publicize his work, criticism began to pour in from all directions. Some of it related to precise points of doctrine, but a lot of it focusing on his profession as a monk, which made him an intellectual pauper, sort of constrained within his cloister with no role beyond its walls. Now, however weary the monks of Saint-Laurent must have been of ecclesiastical strife, this was a serious matter that struck at the heart of traditional monastic life and their customary rites. It amounted in some ways to nothing less than an attempt to overturn the partnership upon which both the church and the school of Liège had been founded, and to redraw the boundaries of intellectual culture in the diocese so as to kind of relegate monks to their own world of cloistered contemplation. And this was a threat that demanded a response. The clerical family of manuscripts that I highlighted at the start of this presentation was that response, or at least part of that response. And to get at how they worked as a response, as well as the implications of their use, I'd like to look at a few of these manuscripts in greater detail with the remainder of my time. The archetypal member of this clerical family of manuscripts is this little unassuming manuscript. This is KBR 10274880, Codicological Unit 2, only the second half of the manuscript. The script there, if you look on the left-hand side, it looks early-ish to me, probably mid-11th century or maybe even earlier. And the hand, compared with all the other Saint-Laurent manuscripts, is very weird. It doesn't look like any other hand from Saint-Laurent. The decoration is also kind of stylistically unique, and I strongly suspect that the monks of Saint-Laurent did not copy this, but rather acquired it in the early 12th century. Regardless, though, the book was sort of the vanguard in their counterattack on the clergy of Liège. And we know this because of these two messy-looking texts found on the final folio of the manuscript, which I've highlighted for you in the red boxes. And they are more decretals. The monks of Saint-Laurent really love these decretal letters. In this case, they are forged decretals of Pope Boniface and Pope Gregory the Great. They're very famous texts. They're probably composed in the mid-11th century, very possibly in or around the Diocese of Liège. And both of these decretals offer blunt blunt, straightforward defenses of monastic claims to clerical prerogatives. They state that monks are fully worthy of preaching, of giving penance, of giving communion, and performing baptism. In fact, both texts suggest that monks might in fact be more worthy to serve as priests than non-monastic priests, and as a result of this, all criticisms of monk priests should be abandoned. Now, the rest of the manuscript contains a trilogy of 3 works on clerical culture. I've just shown you the opening page of each of them here. John Chrysostom's dialogic on the priesthood, Gregory of Nazianzen's apologetic oration on the priestly office, and a sermon unattributed and untitled in this manuscript, but which usually circulates as a pseudo-Ambrosian text. Just really briefly, I want to note that those forged decretals that I pointed out, they have a wide circulation in Northern Europe. They've been extensively studied, mostly by John Gilchrist and Giles Constable. But these 2 little texts, these 2 little forged decretals, nearly always travel with other texts on the rights of monastic community or with historical texts. This manuscript, which pairs them with works on clerical culture, is unique in the entirety of their known manuscript tradition, a very unusual manuscript. All 3 of these works are very deep examinations of the priestly office. They often accompany Gregory the Great's pastoral rule. They all declare the priestly office to be the highest honor in the church. They emphasize the great dangers and risks faced by those entrusted with the care of souls. And interestingly, the texts of both John Chrysostom and Gregory of Nazianzen use a particular framing device for their discussions. They have central characters who have tried to avoid ordination on account of its lofty expectations and dangers. And I think this is a conceit that must have resonated with monks at Saint-Laurent who were rejecting ordination while Oppert was still excommunicated. It's not unique, but I do think this is a remarkable compendium of text to find in a monastic community, and the monks of Saint-Laurent might have read and reacted to it in a number of different ways. It can obviously be read as a defensive attempt to justify the clerical status of monks. So much seems to be the case from the forged decretals on the final page, while the text on clerical culture would have demonstrated the reconcilability of monastic and clerical life, in which monks were able to assume the 2 basic duties of a priest, performing the sacraments and teaching the word. And as a brief aside here, one other manuscript belonging to this family, this clerical family of manuscripts, is a copy of Julianus Pomerius's On the Active and Contemplative Life, a work on the clerical life that was hugely popular in the 9th century. And unlike most works on the active and contemplative life composed in the 12th century, which treat the active and contemplative life as different callings, distinct callings, Julianus's work actually treats the contemplative life as the culmination of the active life, precisely the point that the position that the monks of Saint-Laurent would have wanted to advocate. And given the events transpiring in the Church of Liège between 1090 and 1110, the monks of Saint-Laurent might also have read this previous trilogy of works, not just as sort of an attempt to defend their own position as priests, but also as kind of a critique of clerics. All 3 discuss the dangers of failing to live up to the lofty requirements of the priesthood. John Chrysostom's apology and the unattributed sermon particularly lament the widespread shortcomings of the clergy of their day. The latter of them focuses on simony. It's hard to imagine a monk of Saint-Laurent reading this material and not immediately thinking of the clergy of Liège, and particularly Oppert, who was an accused simoniac. The manuscript might also have been designed to speak not to the clergy of Liège, but to the monastic community of Saint-Laurent itself, as kind of a tool for renewing the sacerdotal aspects of monastic vocation. All 3 of these readings, of course, are totally complementary. The manuscript was designed to renew priestly life at Saint-Laurent, and through that renewal, defend it, while also offering the clergy of Liège a pointed reminder of their own bishop's failings. It almost feels counterintuitive, but for the monks of Saint-Laurent, one of the legacies of the ecclesiastical conflict in Liège was a revived attempt to embrace sacerdotal identity and a fight to retain their position within the intellectual world of the clergy. And so they sort of found themselves walking an ecclesiological tightrope. arguing both for monasticism's special place outside the control of the secular church, but also its full integration into that church. And to balance themselves on this tightrope, they kind of weighed themselves down with texts defending their position against their critics. And here, just briefly, I think it's worth pointing out that this manuscript that I talked about earlier, pushing monastic reform at Saint-Laurent, and this one, pushing clerical reform, used remarkably similar textual strategies. The earlier one paired a guide to monastic life. This is the customary of Benedict of Aniane, with 2 little canonical excerpts. This latter one paired guides to the clerical life, the sermons of Chrysostom and Gregory of Nazianzen, with canonical excerpts. And I think this is a sign of the extent to which the goal of renewing priestly life at the community was an integral part of monastic reform. However, it wasn't enough simply to legitimize the right and the ability of monks to serve as priests. And on this point, all commentators on clerical culture agreed. Being a priest was not just a matter of ordination, but also of training, that is to say, of education. Even Rupert of Deutz acknowledged that education was an inescapable necessity of being a priest. So for their defense of monastic possession of clerical privilege to have any substance, the monks of Saint-Laurent needed to demonstrate that they had the requisite training. And it was to fulfill this purpose that the scribes of Saint-Laurent designed the remaining books of this clerical family of manuscripts. As I noted at the start of my presentation, all of these manuscripts share material features with KBR 1027480, this book containing the trilogy of texts on clerical culture. Small size, long lines of text, and decorative initials. And this is a combination of features not found in any other books from Saint-Laurent, only from these books that relate to clerical culture, this specific combination of features. So I've got 3 other books here up on the screen. Let's look at the contents of these manuscripts very briefly. The focal point of a priest's vocation is the Mass. This fact was, if anything, perhaps even more true for monk priests who were theoretically supposed to celebrate Mass every day. This is a practice that required the proliferation of private Masses. And at the heart of the Mass was the Eucharist, the ritual centerpiece of sacerdotal life, the significance of which increased considerably in the 12th century. Scribes at Saint-Laurent understood the importance of this subject and took steps to ensure that their monks could receive training not only in administering, but also in understanding the nature of the Eucharist. The fruits of their labor survive in the form of 2 books of Eucharistic theology, both of them among the very smallest surviving manuscripts from Saint-Laurent. You can kind of get a sense of their scale from my little fingers in the pictures of the 2 on the left hand there. The first one, Darmstadt ULB 700, contains Paschasius Radbertus's 9th century On the Body and Blood of the Lord. The second one, KBR 10807-11-2, contains Lanfranc's 11th century refutation of Berengar of Tours' Eucharistic theology. A couple of observations about these 2 manuscripts. Both of them contain works not just of Eucharistic theology, but works specifically linked to the 2 most important Eucharistic debates in the Central Middle Ages. Not quite sure what to make of that fact. Second, the copy of Lanfranc of Canterbury's work is an absolutely singular example of what we might call a modern text in Saint-Laurent's library. Scribes at the community show absolutely zero interest in any post-Carolingian texts except for this work, which I think is an indication of the community's newly developed interest in up-to-date works on Eucharistic theology and the Mass. Now, in theory, of course, all monks should have had some working knowledge of the Eucharist and the Mass, regardless of whether they were ordained. But these are issues that the training of priest monks or monk priests would have had to cover, and the production of multiple books of Mass theology at precisely the moment when the community was trying to defend and revive the priestly life of the community suggests that they were made with an eye toward monks who actually perform the Mass. And I think this is confirmed by the third manuscript that I have up here, Munich Bayerische Staatsbibliothek Seal M23261, what we would call a late sacramentary or a proto-missal, first, bad term. Forget I ever said proto-missal. Let's go with late sacramentary, for celebrating the Mass that is nearly identical in format in terms of size, text layout, decoration, to the two books of Eucharistic theology, except it's much more luxurious. Gold leaf is used here. There are several full-page miniatures. And by producing such a luxurious sacramentary at a moment when the status of monk priest was being questioned in Liège, the community signaled an increased commitment to the performance of the Mass. And when it's placed alongside the two books of Mass theology, we see what appears to be a materially unified trio of books to be studied and used by monk priests. I'd like to conclude by talking about the kind of interpretive conundrum this group of books seems to present to me, and perhaps a hypothetical solution to that problem. It seems a very straightforward claim to say that the presence of these books represented part of a broader attempt to defend and renew clerical life at Saint-Laurent by making provision for the education of priests. But monks had been trained as priests at Saint-Laurent since it was founded back in 1026, and yet there is no cadre of books from its earlier history that seems designed to educate priests in the way that these 12th century books do. Perhaps this is not so surprising, though, as scholars like Maureen Miller, Julia Barrow, Joseph Goering have suggested. Clerical education in that earlier era was often accomplished through a sort of liturgical apprenticeship, a participatory form of learning in which an aspiring cleric trained with an ordained priest. Maybe there are no books for training priests from 11th century Saint-Laurent because such training was accomplished through human resources, through practicing priests. In the early 12th century, when scribes and scholars at Saint-Laurent copied out this clerical family of manuscripts, they were not only trying to renew priestly education in the community, they were organizing its renewal around a new approach to education, or at least a newly emphasized approach to education, characterized by the introduction of the written word, a new form of media, into a pedagogical practice previously dominated by human exemplars and participation. In some ways, the key question presented by these books is not why Saint-Laurent suddenly put emphasis on training priests, but why they chose to do so by intensifying the role of the written word in that education. The answer, I might suggest completely hypothetically, has to do with the conflict between the clergy of Liège and the monks of Saint-Laurent. Could the clergy's claim that monks had no place in their intellectual world have deprived the monastic community of their resources for clerical training, the cathedral clergy themselves? We know that most of the scholars from 11th century Saint-Laurent studied with masters at the cathedral, not at Saint-Laurent itself. That's where they went to school, so to speak. And the Bishop of Liège would have been responsible for overseeing the training of priests that he ordained. When the clergy of Liège began to clamor that the monks should not serve as priests, did they back that position up by cutting the monks off from networks of clerical education? Perhaps the books of this clerical family of manuscripts at Saint-Laurent were designed to sort of replace human teachers that were lost to the community due to the rift between cloister and cathedral. Perhaps they were intended to serve as kind of surrogate masters that could be used to at least claim Saint-Laurent was still current in terms of its clerical education. This might explain why, for this topic and only this topic, the community acquired a text by a modern master, Lanfranc of Canterbury, because to replace currently teaching masters, they needed a text that was as current as possible. To conclude, it seems that precisely because clerical status was tied to education and training, the ecclesiastical crisis in Liège spilled over into the realm of learning and intellectual culture, and at Saint-Laurent had the effect of perhaps reorienting education around a new form of media, the written word. And this transformation is an indication, I think, of the ways in which the history of monastic education and the history of media were part and parcel of each other. They're parts of the same story. There are two ironies here. First, the 12th century is often thought of as a moment when monastic culture truly came into its own, developing and even perfecting forms of cultural expression proper to their calling. But the monks of Saint-Laurent probably spent more time and energy figuring out how to maintain standards of clerical education in the cloister than they did any other form of learning. The second irony is that when they turned to books to accomplish this, having been deprived of the human resources of the cathedral, this strategy reinforced the very alienation from the clerical world that they were seeking to prevent. How did this play out? Well, charter evidence from the later 12th century confirms that as of about 1160, nearly all of the monks of Saint-Laurent continued to be ordained as priests. No surprises there. But the most luxurious manuscripts produced during that decade were copies of things like Gregory the Great's dialogues and Smaragdus's commentary on the Rule of Benedict, classics of monastic literature. Meanwhile, the most eminent Saint-Laurent scholar of that later era, the 1160s, Rainier of Saint-Laurent, composed an entire chronicle describing all the famous scholars who had lived at Saint-Laurent, apparently in an attempt to promote his own work and break into a wider intellectual world. But there is absolutely no sign that anyone outside of the cloister of Saint-Laurent ever read a single one of his works. He was somehow inside the clerical world, and yet at the same time, kind of on the outside looking in at it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful paper. Right. Thank you.
Thank you,
Jay, for this very, very nice paper. I think it was very convincing. A lot of documents you know so well. I remember having already listened to talks that you've done here and there, and especially in New York, and it was already brilliant. It was the case here too. So there are a lot of things here to discuss. I'm not to discuss to say that it's not possible, but to discuss, to go further, and to think to possible explanations, and to think how to link all these discoveries to other cases. I don't know, perhaps I will give the word to the audience to see if to ask for some questions. Don't hesitate to intervene, don't hesitate to ask the word. You can ask questions in the discussion. You can also open your cam if you want. Do exactly what you want. Nothing? No question by there? Anyway, no problem. I have a lot of questions, as I said. First question, when it's so the Saint-Laurent has some kind of special status in Liège, but do you know if we can find similar cases elsewhere in the other Benedictine foundations around Liège, or in some important abbeys, for example, Saint-Jacques?
Yeah.
Saint-Jacques, I don't know. Saint-Jacques, you have some manuscripts which are left there. Did the monks here have the same did they react the same as the monks in Saint-Laurent? Had they the same problems? Had they the same problem? I don't know.
Yeah. So I think Saint-Jacques is a really good point of comparison. They did have a lot of the same problems. They were founded essentially as a sister abbey of Saint-Laurent in some ways, have a lot of texts in common in their library, have some very similar presentational strategies in their manuscripts, also adopted the customs of Cluny right around the same time. So there are a lot of parallels between Saint-Laurent and Saint-Jacques. What I haven't been able to find at Saint-Jacques, and I'll admit I don't know their manuscript collection nearly as well as I know Saint-Laurent's, but the kind of ways in which the manuscripts of Saint-Laurent seem to map so carefully and intentionally onto these ecclesiastical conflicts. I haven't seen that level of contextualizability in the Saint-Jacques manuscripts, which I think maybe is why I've spent a little less time working on them than the Saint-Laurent manuscripts. That said, there is probably material that we know, for instance, they do have a copy of those little forged decretals that I mentioned that are at the end of the clerical manuscript here, contextualized in a very different way into a manuscript kind of having to do with monastic history and monastic conversion and stuff like this. So they were responding to all the same problems. They had all the same problems as Saint-Laurent for sure. But and this is a very preliminary answer for me, because the interest is in trying to figure out how manuscripts responded and shaped these kinds of situations. I haven't seen that so much at Saint-Jacques, which is probably why I haven't spent as much time with the manuscripts there. Some of Saint-Jacques' manuscripts are very close in format to Saint-Laurent's. There are also other weird discrepancies. So for instance, Saint-Laurent has a tiny little manuscript of Pseudo-Hegesippus' chronicle, very unusual. And Saint-Jacques has an enormous copy of the same work. So yeah, I'm not sure this quite answers your question to say that it's a great point of comparison, but the alignment between what seems to be happening with some of the manuscripts at Saint-Laurent doesn't seem to match up exactly with what is going on at Saint-Jacques. You would hope for similar things at Saint-Hubert, where the abbot is also deposed. They also have a collection of the same canon law collection, the collection in 74 titles. You'd hope for some similar things there, but so few manuscripts from Saint-Hubert have survived, almost none. Saint-Trond, another good point of comparison, but most of their big moments of Scrabble production are later in the 12th century, 1150s, 1160s. So a more difficult comparison there as well. And of course, Gemblot and Loeb, earlier manuscript production, mostly lost in the case of Loeb, but these are also both very imperial facing abbeys who were big supporters of the bishop during this entire era. And so you might expect different things there.
I just ask myself, could it be that some explanation to the discrepancy between the erection in Saint-Jacques and in Saint-Laurent could be the implication of the community or of people? I mean, is all the extraordinary manuscript landscape in Saint-Laurent and the special action, there's a special dedication of these manuscripts to this conflict between the bishop and the community. Is it the matter of the community, or could it be that there is just one or two or three people behind all that stuff?
Yeah, I agree. So I'm a big believer, for whatever it's worth, in taking individual monasteries as kind of interpretive units in and of themselves, that you can take a single scriptorium, a single monastic community, whatever this awkward word community means, and kind of study it for internal dynamics and things like this. You don't always have to look for textual tradition and stuff. And this is why the families of manuscripts at Saint-Laurent are such good fodder for my analysis. That said, you're right. There are very few scribal hands at Saint-Laurent, I think. I'm still trying to rigorously count them up. It wasn't the big purpose of this project, but it is probably not many. It's not an enormous monastic community to begin with, and it would not surprise me if in some ways a lot of this, the arguments that are being directed through these manuscripts are the responsibility of only like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people. Now, an interesting point about this, though, real quick, is those those texts about whether or not ordinations by schismatics are valid or not, added to the end of the canon law manuscript, represent 3 different positions in the end, right? They're not a coherent sort of, here's the argument on it. And in part of my mind, I like to imagine that the community itself is arguing about this, because we know some monks in Saint-Laurent do accept ordinations and other monks do not accept ordinations. It's a point of contention in the monastery itself. And the fact that we have 3 little texts that outline 3 different positions on this in one community, copied by 3 different hands in the same manuscript, maybe suggests that there could be a sign in which some of these texts are reflecting ongoing debates in the whole community.
No, you're definitely right. No, it's fascinating. And about that, did you encounter similar cases elsewhere? I mean, dossier, for example, as the dossier of the treaties on priesthoods and related to, of course, decretals or not decretals, but similar dossier in other abbeys elsewhere in Europe at the same time, because this kind of problem is very common in this society, in the European Christendom at the time. So it could be normal to find similar cases elsewhere.
So this little dossier of texts relating to sort of clerical education, I didn't piece together the coherence of that little family of manuscripts until maybe a year or so ago. I'm not quite sure when. So I haven't had much chance to look and see. So they're common texts. So you find this John Chrysostom oration. You definitely find them often paired with Gregory the Great's pastoral rule, which is kind of the archetypal text on clerical culture and stuff like this. So you definitely find all of these texts commonly throughout 11th and 12th century Benedictine monasteries. What I would like to know, and what I don't know, is if there are many cases where we have such a focused, coherent group of those kind of patristic texts on clerical culture, contemporary works on Eucharistic theology, this sacramentary. I mean, it's hard for me to overstate how similar these books look to each other. They're all within very close, in terms of size, always one layer of text, always scrupulously with decorated initials throughout them. I mean, they're just so materially unified. I just have to imagine in the monastery they were kept together as a little group of manuscripts that was like, here's the books for priests, here's the book for monks, priests. Whether or not there'd be like that little miniature library, I would love to know. I don't know of any other examples. I haven't found any. There's nothing on book lists or anything like that that would suggest the common existence of little subgroups of books like this. The little shorter lists are always about books to be read in chapter and stuff like that. So I don't know the answer to this question. I would love to know, though.
Another question, still important question to my point of view, of course. What about the origin of these forged decretals? Have you found the manuscript origin? Have you found the place of where do they come from?
The Pseudo-Gregorian, Pseudo-Boniface ones. Yeah, so John Gilchrist has done the stemma for those in his article and edition on them. Right. So they're definitely Northern Europe. They are definitely mid-11th century in origin. A lot of the evidence does point to Liège or somewhere immediately around there. Interestingly, though, he did not know these copies. These copies are not in the stemma or in his lists of the manuscripts, the 2 copies that are in this manuscript. And also, interestingly, Giles Constable, who wrote on these when studying the Hortotonos, knew that Rupert of Deutz had cited these decretals, but also did not know of these. But also did not know of these copies in the Saint-Laurent manuscript. I mean, it's they're kind of buried on the last page in some ways. So this is interesting. I'm not a good enough textual transmission scholar to probably insert. I will not be able to do the work of inserting these into the stemma or anything like this, but someone should do that at some point and figure out if what this does to.
No, it could be of great interest, because doing that you should just point the importance of this transmission. If these decretals are coming from manuscript in the Liège area or in other Benedictine areas, and if you can find some the very place of the copying, I don't know, or the very place of the very manuscript, which was the basis of the copying. I don't know.
I think the general consensus is that they must originate in probably a Benedictine area, maybe one of these sort of centers that has a lot of interest in canonical texts like Rheims, like Liège, maybe somewhere in Cambrai or something like this. But yeah, somebody should grab the copies of these and redo the stemma of text for it and see what happens. Yeah.
No, right. Is there any question? I think everyone is fascinated, but I don't. Perhaps a bit shy. Yes, Valérie Ton.
Yes, hi. First of all, I just want to say, like, I found it a really fascinating presentation. So even though I don't know a lot about the subject myself, I really enjoyed it. But I had a question. I don't know if there is like an answer to it or not, but I just figured out I'll ask it.
Yeah.
Because the monks, they defended themselves and they tried to defend, like, we can be priests also and be monks at the same time.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, because I believe you said that around 1160 there were still monks who were also ordained as priests.
Yeah.
Can we interpret this as being a fact that the clergy accepted their defense, that they thought, like, yeah, okay, you're right, you can still be ordained as priest? I don't know if there's an answer to it, but it was just something I wondered. Yeah.
One of the interesting things is that this debate, as it begins at Saint-Laurent, has quite a long afterlife. I mean, Rupert of Deutz, maybe 10 years after this particular dispute, writes an entire text, the Alternatio Monachiae, a debate between a monk and a cleric, arguing that monks should be allowed to be priests. And for a little while, it becomes a kind of hot button issue in sort of monastic politics, debates about the relationship between the clerical life and the monastic life, debates about their reconcilability or irreconcilability. And some of the newer monastic orders at the time kind of give it up and say monastic and active life, or active and contemplative life, are different things, and sort of decline ordination and stuff like this. But in the end, the Benedictines just carry on. The sort of traditional Black monks carry on being ordained basically through the rest of the Middle Ages. The interesting thing is, and this is something I would like to look into more, is at the time I'm talking about, in the late 11th century, ordination as priest would have meant things like you had the office of preaching, you could be a teacher within the cathedral school, and all these sorts of things. And I wonder if, as time went on, there was a kind of sticking to the letter of the law, whereby monks continued to be ordained as priests and continued to celebrate Mass in the monastery, but perhaps lost some of the broader prerogatives that would go with this, that they sort of began to be shut out of a broader clerical intellectual culture and stuff like this. You're very hard pressed to find many monks after, say, 1110 who seem to be active scholars outside of the cloister that much, whereas in Liège before 1110 you have dozens of them, known partnerships with masters in the cathedral school, known activity where they are publishing works not intended for circulation within monasteries, but intended for circulation everywhere. So this is something to look into, I think, whether or not ordination continued, but something was lost anyway as it went on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there another question? Nobody by now.
That's quite all right.
I had just asked myself, what about the idea of your hypothesis of teaching and learning by themselves? Did you find in the manuscripts traces, hints of this process of learning by themselves,
Yeah.
done by the monks?
Yeah, it's a good question. I need to sort of nuance what I'm talking about there, because I suspect it didn't just simply turn into a situation where monks were learning how to be priests by reading books. I suspect they were studying with another monk who was a priest in the monastery, and these books became more important resources in that model of learning than they had been before. I'm not sure how else to explain the sudden appearance of these books at this particular moment or anything. Now, there are a lot of annotations, a lot of marginal annotations throughout a lot of Saint-Laurent manuscripts. I think all attributable to one figure. And yeah, I think it's probably Rupert of Deutz, but they are all found in scriptural commentaries, patristic commentaries on scripture. And he's probably working on his own exegetical works there. This is a big chapter that I'm still working on right now. These little clerical miscellanies have no marginal markings or anything, no notes or anything like this on them. I think, again, that this is telling, actually, though, because these big patristic commentaries on scripture were one monk sitting with them, taking notes for his own study and stuff like this. Whereas these clerical manuscripts, I think the best way to imagine them being used is in a setting where there is a teacher and students working from them. And so it's less sitting in wherever in the monastery, annotating and reading for personal study, and more for sort of group education and things like this, where there'd be less kind of sitting down and annotating. But this is very hypothetical. I'm not sure about this at this point, but it is an interesting divide that these little miscellanies, pretty bare margins, occasionally little nota marks, but I don't know what the date is on these so much. Whereas in these big patristic commentaries on scripture, you find many notes in the margins that are subsequent to the original copying of the manuscript. So somebody is working on those.
Very well. Fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think perhaps no question. No, everyone is probably
we're all tired right now.
tired and convinced, so nobody has anything to say, just to admire the quality of your paper and of your hypothesis. I think you have given us a very important paper today.
Thank you.
And we enjoy. I'm sure that there are some interventions in the chat to say thank you. So I will close here the session, the webinar for today. I will thank again once more very warmly Jay for his wonderful paper. I hope we will see us soon, very concretely in the US. I hope so, or perhaps in the KBR. We will see in the KBR.
Yeah,
we'll see.
I miss it very much, so I can't wait to go back. Yeah.
Yes, we miss you a lot too.
Yeah.
So thank you so much to
thank you so
and
much
to
for having
everyone.
Me and for making time and everything. Thank you very much.
No, it was very important. Thank you. Yeah. So next time, 18th of March, we will have with us Antonella Guignoli from Roma, who will speak about applied category analysis for interpreting a list in the late antique documentary tradition, some preliminary considerations. And that's for the 18th of March. By now, we are going to have some rest and to thank again Jay. So
thank you.
Bye to everyone. I hope you will be all right.
Yeah, please stay healthy, stay safe, everyone, and thank you again.
All right.
Yeah.
Que tout aille bien pour tout le monde. Merci. À bientôt.